Welcome to From the Halls of Justice, and we are in West Hollywood, local channel 36. Thank you for being here and thank you for joining us. We have our special guest, Judge Isabel Cohen, and I have a very special co-host with me tonight, Mr. Ronald Melin, or is it Melin? Which one do you?
It's actually Melin.
Ronald Melin Supancic. He's a certified family law specialist. And how many years have you been in family law?
45.
45 years. He's absolutely wonderful. He knows everything there is to know about family law. So that's why I pulled him in and I recruited him to help me interview Your Honor. So
When I got the call, Wanda, I have to tell you that I was particularly touched, thrilled, and delighted because I happen to know the quality of the judicial officer that you've invited to serve as a guest on your program. She's truly extraordinary.
You're very kind.
Well, she had many years in the criminal law where I wasn't involved, but in the years that she sat on the family law bench, she was probably the best luck you could have in assignments. You never know who you're going to get necessarily. You can bounce one and then you have to take what comes along next. But when Isabel Cohen showed up as your bench officer, you were in good shape. What impressed me particularly when I got the resume and started looking at her background, a member of 3 bars,
wow.
New York Bar, Pennsylvania Bar, Washington, D.C. Bar. She was awarded Outstanding Achievement in the Law by the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors in 1981. Outstanding Achievement as a Woman in Government by the California Women in Government Association. And though she retired some years ago, she is still very active, very involved as an available private judge,
right.
arbitrator, mediator, referee. There's a variety of services she continues to perform and is in high demand because of the quality of her judicial demeanor, her knowledge of the law, her experience. She is truly an extraordinary person. What I wanted to know, and the question I had, was what about the little girl that made the decision to become a lawyer, to study law? When I went to law school, it was about the same time. There were 3 women in the whole class at USC. And they all became judges.
Oh my God.
I thought for years it was because they were women. No, it's because they were smarter than anybody else. They had to be to get into law school. So when you were choosing an advanced degree, an advanced educational program after your bachelor's degree, most women were becoming social workers, teachers, nurses. Tell me about the little girl that chose law.
I think at a very early age, and honestly, I swear it goes back to 1st grade or 2nd grade. Now, of course, that's just an impression because I don't remember. But I think at a very early age, I realized at some level that women were on track for 2nd-class citizenship professionally, and I rebelled at that thought. I can remember wanting to be a doctor very early. I'm again thinking 1st grade or 2nd grade, and really not wanting to be a 2nd-class citizen. I had very enlightened parents, and they encouraged whatever it was I had in my little mind.
And then the young woman that chose law school became a lawyer, and then at some point set her sights on the judiciary, decided to become a judge. How did that transformation occur?
That's a very hard question because I would like to say I did set my sights on being a judge, but I really didn't. I think what happened is because I went to law school 100 years ago, or it might as well have been. I graduated law school in 1963, and I'm sure most of our viewers weren't born then. I think what happened is that the market was so inhospitable to women that ultimately and eventually, after I had practiced law for some time, because there were no opportunities for, I don't want to use the word important or critical, but I will, positions for women in law, I looked toward the bench. It just so happens I had some acquaintances through my husband who were acquainted with the people in the Brown administration who connected me, and I submitted a personal data questionnaire, and I had some credentials, and so I was appointed in 1979, before most of the viewers were born.
Now, I have a quick question, and our audience doesn't know this, but I think this is fascinating. Both of you. Your Honor, how long have you been married? And Ron, how long have you been married? I think this is very important because we're talking about family law, and it's very impressive.
Shall I go first?
Ladies first.
Okay. I think I'm going to be in my 53rd year come this June of marriage.
That's awesome.
And we went to law school together and got married at the end of our second year. We were a briefing pool and everybody else dropped out, so what was I to do?
I beat you by 1 month. We got married in May of '62.
Yes, you did.
And I think we have children about the same time. We were talking in the green room, and we both have adult children.
We do.
Now that's what I call success. That's absolutely wonderful. Please continue.
But I want to get back to this this resume. I have to say it was just, I guess it wasn't a surprise. It was more of an affirmation, because I've always known that you were an extraordinary person. But you were a judge that taught other judges. You were actually involved in the California Judges Association, the executive committee, and the ethics committee, and served on the judicial education and research governing the education for all California judges. That's staggering. How did you get into teaching other judges the law?
Well, I took the courses, and I think that I was selected along with other members of the class, and the courses I took were for judges and by judges, because the Center for Judicial Education and Research governs continuing education of California judges. It's, I think it's created in the government code by statute. It's a wonderful organization which ensures that California judges are enlightened, that they stay up on the law, and when need be, science and psychology, and it's judges teaching other judges, and all new judges are required to take, I have a feeling you're going to ask me this anyway, and I'll elaborate when you do, but to take an orientation program of 8 days in the first few months, and then to go to judicial college within a year or two. And then there's higher education, which is the seizure classes that are taught in special fields. And so I took all of those courses and was recruited, and especially jurisprudence was my favorite. I didn't teach the course itself. Scholars did, but I, along with other student judges, were asked back to lead seminar groups in the course of the jurisprudence program.
In the green room, you talked about judicial boot camp, and I think you said it was 10 hours a day from 8 in the morning till 6 in the evening, and it was 7 days a week. That's 70 hours of intense training. And do all California judges have that kind of training?
They do, or they did when I got on the bench in 1979. The seizure waits 6 to 8 weeks before putting a judge into this so-called boot camp. The name of it, of course, is orientation. And then we are force-fed criminal law, civil law, procedural law, evidence, and etc. For 10 hours a day for 7 days, so that we become able to sit anywhere in the judicial system. And before we sit for 6 to 8 weeks, taking orientation is something which is so difficult to assimilate or absorb that we could not really do it without the experience. So this orientation program is expected to fall on the ears of judges who have experientially known some, at least, of what's being taught.
How does this compare to other judicial systems outside of California?
I think California's judicial education system is highly regarded, if not the most highly regarded in the country. There is a national judicial college, which I have been to twice. I took courses when I was on municipal court on the kinds of criminal law that come before municipal court judges, with an emphasis on driving under the influence, which is a very difficult kind of case to sit on, but which really is the mainstay of the municipal court. And I can tell you that while the courses I took at the National College for Judicial Education were impressive, they were not taught to California law, or any state in particular, because it's a national college, and it was much more generalized, and in some ways, namely that way, not as effective for California judges as California judicial education is.
Lawyers that I talk to tell me that passing the bar was the hardest thing they ever had to do, harder than law school, harder than undergraduate school, and you're a member of multiple bars. Now, how on earth did that happen?
Well, let me start by saying I'm not a member of the New York State Bar, though I went to law school in New York State. My husband from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, moved me immediately to Pennsylvania to take the Pennsylvania Bar.
Okay.
And then he moved me to Washington, D.C. to take the Washington, D.C. Bar. And then he moved me to California to take the California Bar. And that is because, as I am 100 years old, the law then said that the domicile of the wife is the domicile of the husband. I graduated law school in 1963, when that was the law in just about every state, I believe. And in fact, just to give you an idea of how old that makes me, when I graduated in 1963, I think it was the Girard College of Philadelphia case was being tried, which had a condition that only white orphans would be admitted in this boarding school.
Wow.
It was struck down in 1963 or 64, or it might have been 1963, and we got wind of it in that year. So there you have a bit of ancient history.
Well, Judge, with all due respect, I don't think there's anything wrong with your memory.
And with all due respect, since I don't have a case before you, I can tell you that you are an absolutely beautiful woman. So
this is much more than I bargained for by coming here today. Thank you, Wanda.
So the lawyer practiced law for a number of years.
Yes.
Then the lawyer took the oath and took the robe and moved on to the bench.
I did.
How was that different in terms of your perspective of the law, what you'd been taught in the law, and what now you were learning on the front line?
Well, I started in the law at Legal Aid Foundation actually at Western Center on Law and Poverty, and from there I went to Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. And this was in 1969 when we moved here from Washington, D.C. And I was, I think, 30 at the time. I had 2 children in the meantime. And I can remember that most of the time, most of my clients became, I want to say became one with me, but I suppose I ought to say I became one with them. I did not know, and part of it was because I was young and idealistic, and part of it was because I was young and immature psychologically. I did not know where my skin stopped and theirs began, which for a legal aid lawyer was a very handy thing. It made me very committed to what I viewed as their cause. And by 10 years later, when I was appointed to the bench, I had attained some small measure of maturity, and I at least knew where my skin ended and theirs began. By that time, I was at the Department of Corporations. And let me just inject something which I may already have said, which is that it was very difficult for women in the law at that time. I was one of 6 women in a law school class of 200 to graduate in 1963. And so the bench provided a way up, which private practice did not. But I do remember, to hark back to the question that's pending, I do remember that the first thing that startled me about being on the bench is that I couldn't just get up and walk off. I was stuck there for the morning and then stuck there for the afternoon and extemporized, which for a shy person, and yes, I do have the shy gene, was difficult. I had to bite my tongue just to come out in the morning. However, the experience of being a neutral, because that's what you are when you're on the bench and you take an oath to do so, was a mandate, not simply a function of maturation. So I very quickly learned the difference between my thoughts and my feelings, and because I took an oath to follow the law, tried very hard to monitor myself so that my feelings wouldn't creep into my rulings.
Now, Your Honor, I have a question.
Yes.
We were talking about this in the green room. If judges are elected, or if they have to run for office, and if they must remain independent of politics, what's the process?
Well,
how do you do that?
The first thing that happens is you take an oath to follow the law. So that's a very big impetus. And not only an impetus, it's a sworn commitment. And so, as I was saying, if you are a good person, and I think most judges are good people, like any other good person, you attempt to cleave to your commitment and to obey your commitment. But the good thing about being on the bench, especially for years as opposed to days or hours or weeks or months, but because you so often, every day, in every way, practice being neutral, it really comes to you and you acquire that skill, and it is an attribute and a skill which is acquired. I think it is, over time, it becomes stronger, and you have a greater ability to do it the more you do it. So to answer your question, if you are appointed by a political power, which I was, the state governor, which is a political office, or you run for election and you may have a political bent, you take an oath, not in essence, not to be result-oriented. And your entire experience sitting on the bench is practice in that. And you get better and better at it.
So, working in the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, gave you a sense of values that must have affected the way that you looked at cases and parties when they came before you as a judge. How did the work that you did in the Legal Aid Foundation, how did that affect you as a judge, do you think?
Well, I'm going to say that the fact that I went to Legal Aid in the first place, or Western Center on Law and Poverty in the very first place, and Legal Aid in the second place, because Western Center on Law and Poverty is a backup agency for Legal Aid Foundation work, public law, was a manifestation of my values, I think, to begin with, which is that I value access to the justice system for all people, rich or poor, and whatever religion, ethnicity, race. That is a pretty deeply held value, and if at Legal Aid I was an advocate, which I was, I had to stop being an advocate when I got on the bench, and I had to be a neutral. However, the values which formed me, which I suppose prompted my career choices, though I will say they were partly shaped by the fact that there weren't a lot of other career choices for women at that time, except in public service or legal aid kinds of services programs. So the values that formed me are part of me, and as much as I can, I monitor myself to be sure that my values aren't pushing around my judgment in cases where they ought not to, and I'm supposed to be not result oriented, and I think I have been not result oriented, and that of course would get into a discussion of the rule of law.
You've also sat as an appellate justice in the California appellate courts. How was that different than serving as a bench officer in the Superior Court?
It was very different. It was one of the best experiences of my life. I sat 6 months on the Court of Appeal as a temporary justice of the Court of Appeal and decided cases which were very difficult, one of which was a patent case. The Court of Appeal no longer hears patent cases. The only reason I had jurisdiction is because the state had what was called pendant jurisdiction in a patent case where the affirmative defense was breach of the patent, and that being a breach of contract law, it was governed by state law at the time. The state no longer has what is called pendant jurisdiction in patent cases. That's strictly federal. But the experience was an ivory tower. I relished and loved it. I can be very legalistic. I can be very scholarly, and so for me to be confined to the books is a wonderful experience. However, in retrospect, I will say I'm also gregarious, and I think that the diet of the ivory tower, while I would have adjusted quite nicely to it, was very well supplanted or replaced by my time on the Superior Court and the Municipal Court, because I'm also, as I say, a people person, and it's important for me to have personal interaction.
So for the last 15 years, since you've left the Superior Court, you've had a very different kind of practice as a peacemaker, dispute resolutionist, serving in a variety of roles. What are the things that you do today that really are the most exciting things, the things that you most love to do?
Well, the first thing I love is the law. Well, I guess I love my family, and I value relationships, but I love the law. And So retirement for me, I knew, was not going to be rest or
Fishing.
purely gardening. Yeah. So I am fortunate because my husband is a lawyer that I have access to resources which support me in as a privately compensated neutral, either as a judge, which is not very different from what I did on the bench, and parties hire me because their trials will go more quickly than they go on the public bench these days, most unfortunately, or for any other reason they may have. And I do many more mediations than I do litigation. The reason is that litigation has really become prohibitively expensive for ordinary citizens, and it's really the smartest tack to take. Mostly I do, by the way, family law.
Really?
And, yes, and litigation is prohibitively expensive. It can devour the entire community estate, whereas mediation, which is a much shorter process, and it's a process of compromise, can result in a win-win situation for both sides and preserve what there is left of a community estate.
Now, I'm going to jump in, Your Honor,
Please.
because we have 1 minute and 22 seconds
Ooh,
left.
that's not enough time.
I know, it was very
I have
fast.
10 more questions.
And the reason why I invited and I needed Ron Melin Supancic, Certified Family Law Specialist, with us here this evening is because actually, to me, Mr. Supancic is the Stu Webb of the West Coast. For me, I know that Mr. Supancic really believes in mediation and preserving the family at all cost, even if you decide to go your separate paths. So we have 44 seconds, and I want to thank you both for appearing on the show tonight on local channel 36 in West Hollywood, coming out here. And kudos also to Mr. Supancic. He now has 2 offices, Woodland Hills, Beverly Hills. And you are also very active and still doing mediations in family law and several different other areas also.
Your advice to couples in the last words of the show who are facing family crisis, what's your advice?
I think you have to get help from mental health professionals, and if the marriage doesn't last, don't embroil the children in a custody battle. Settle, settle, settle.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. From the halls of justice.
How do we do on time?
I think I went over.
We made it?
We're going to do this again because we have more questions.
Yeah, I was going to go into the whole recession and the financial setbacks and the destruction of the courts with the layoff of the judges. All that
So
happened after
sad.
you left. They laid off
Yeah.
400 judges and I don't know how many staff.
Oh,
It's
my
just
God.
horrible.
Yeah, they closed courtrooms all over the county.
I know.
People have to, and we have no public transportation.
It takes 2 years to get a trial date.
It's
I
crazy.
mean, I was at a program given by Jared Diamond, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Yeah,
And he was talking about indigenous peoples solve their disputes in 4 days. I mean, you either settle the dispute or there's a war. I mean, they go to war. So they have to have process, and they deal with the emotional agendas. They deal with the feelings. And the most common disputes are over pigs and women.
Oh my God.
and they buy women.